Idaho Territory, 1883. The bullet missed Ira Keene's temple by less than an inch. His hat spun once in the dust outside the mercantile, and Mabel stood close enough that a second mistake could have taken her with him. For a heartbeat, nobody in Flint Rock moved. Roan Voss still had his revolver out. Smoke curled from the barrel. He wore the grin of a young man who had expected laughter and found silence instead. Ira did not reach for either Colt. That was what made the street uneasy. He looked at Mabel first. She had one hand pressed against the wagon rail, knuckles pale against the weathered wood. Her eyes moved from the smoking gun to the hat lying near Ira's boot. She did not call his name. She did not step away. Ira bent and picked up the hat. Dust clung to the felt. A clean hole had been punched through the brim. He turned it once in his hands. "My wife gave me that hat." Roan's grin thinned. Somewhere behind him, a harness buckle clicked. A horse stamped at the hitching rail. Wind pushed grit beneath the boardwalk and rattled a loose sign above the dressmaker's door. Nobody laughed. Roan glanced toward Pearl Dace. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded, not impressed, not frightened for him yet, just watching him the way a person watches a bad decision becoming worse. Roan's jaw tightened. Ira settled the damaged hat against his leg and said nothing more. He looked like an aging rancher in a worn coat, a man who should have been thinking about flour, fence posts, and getting home before dark. Then Abe Tern saw the gray horse tied beside the wagon. Buck lifted his head. Abe went still. His face lost color as his eyes moved from the horse to Ira, then to the old leather beneath Ira's coat. "Roan," Abe said quietly. Roan did not look at him. Abe's voice dropped lower. "Take your hand off that gun." That finally turned Roan's head. "Why?" Abe did not answer at once. Across the street, Dale Wren straightened from the post he had been leaning against. A woman pulled her child behind her skirt. Even the deputy's office down the road seemed too far away now. Abe kept staring at Ira. Then he said, almost to himself, "I've seen that gray horse before." Roan's fingers twitched beside his holster. And for the first time that morning, Ira Keene's hand moved too. 3 hours earlier, Keene Ranch had been quiet enough to hear the wind combing through the dry grass beyond the corral. Mabel Keene stood at the kitchen table, folding a scrap of paper around a short supply list. "Flour, sugar, blue thread." Ira poured the last of the coffee into his cup. "That all?" "For today." She glanced toward the peg beside the door. His hat hung there, faded brown, sweat darkened at the band, the brim softened by years of sun and weather. "You're still wearing that thing?" Ira looked over his shoulder. "You bought it. Near 20 years ago. Still fits." Mabel smiled and shook her head. She had bought it in Boise City when the hat Ira owned then looked as though rain, dust, and bad roads had all taken turns trying to kill it. She had told the clerk she wanted something that belonged on a man who planned to stay somewhere a while. At the time, Ira had said nothing. But when spring came, he did not leave. He repaired the south fence instead, then the barn roof. Then he planted cottonwoods near the house, though 2 died before 1 finally took. Mabel never asked him to explain the change. Some promises were more trustworthy when a man made them with his hands. Outside, Buck waited beside the wagon, gray hide silver beneath the morning light. Ira checked the traces twice. Then his eyes moved past the barn toward the ridge. Mabel noticed. "You still watch the tree line." "Not all of it." "That progress?" Ira gave her a sideways look. "Caution isn't fear." "No, but you used to confuse the two." He tightened one buckle, then let his hand rest there a moment. "Some habits take longer." Mabel climbed into the wagon. "And some men." That earned the smallest smile. The road toward Flint Rock ran through open grazing country, across a shallow creek and past fences Ira had known long enough to remember when they were new. Nothing followed them. Nothing waited in the brush. By every visible measure, it was an ordinary Saturday. That was exactly why Ira began to relax. By noon, he would be carrying sacks of flour. By sundown, he expected to be back on his own porch beside Mabel. The hat on his head meant he had chosen that life once. Neither of them knew he would have to choose it again before the day was over. Flint Rock was already crowded when Ira turned the wagon onto Main Street. Saturday brought ranch families in from miles around. Wagons stood wheel to wheel beside the hitching rails. Men carried hides and butter into the stores and came out with coffee, lamp oil, nails, and flour. Children slipped between wagon tongues while dogs slept beneath the boardwalk shade. Mabel moved through her list without hurry. At the mercantile, Ira lifted 2 sacks of flour into the wagon bed. At the dressmaker's window, Mabel paused over a spool of blue thread she did not need badly enough to justify admiring it as long as she did. Ira bought it anyway. Then, while she was looking elsewhere, he added a small paper sack of peppermint candy. Mabel noticed. She pretended not to. Across the street, Roan Voss noticed something else. Pearl Dace stood in the dressmaker's doorway. For nearly a month, Roan had tried every respectable method he knew to make her look at him differently. Flowers, compliments, an offer to walk her home after church. Pearl had accepted none of it cruelly, but she had accepted none of it warmly either. Roan had spent 3 months making sure Flint Rock knew he was fast with a revolver. That morning, nobody seemed interested. He leaned against a post, watching Ira carry another package toward the wagon. Old man, worn hat, quiet wife, safe audience. "Keene," Roan called. Ira heard him. He kept loading the wagon. A few men nearby looked over. Roan pushed away from the post. "That hat's older than half the horses in this county." Someone gave a short laugh. "Not Pearl." Ira set the package down carefully. Mabel looked at him, then at Roan. There was no fear in her face yet, only attention. Roan mistook Ira's silence for weakness. "Could improve it for you," he said. "No charge." Ira finally turned. His eyes did not go first to Roan's face. They went to the young man's right hand, then to Pearl, then back to Roan. "Wasn't asking your opinion on my hat." The laughter died. Roan smiled because too many people were watching now to let the moment go. He glanced once toward Pearl. She had folded her arms. That should have been warning enough. Instead, Roan's fingers lowered toward the butt of his revolver. Roan Voss let his hand settle on the revolver. It was not yet a draw. That almost made it worse. The men nearest the mercantile stepped back just enough to clear the space between him and Ira. Nobody announced what they were doing. In a frontier town, people learned early how to make room for trouble without admitting they expected blood. Mabel stayed beside the wagon. Ira looked at Roan's hand. "Son," he said, "leave it where it is." Roan smiled. "You worried?" "No." The answer came too easily. Pearl Dace shifted in the dressmaker's doorway. Her arms remained folded, but whatever patience had been in her face was gone. Roan saw her watching. He did not understand what he was seeing. "All I'm saying," he called, loud enough for the boardwalk, "is that hat could use improving." Ira turned back toward the wagon. That was the insult Roan could not bear. Being threatened would have given him something to fight. Being ignored made him feel small. His revolver cleared leather. Mabel's hand closed around Ira's forearm. Roan fired. The sound slammed against the storefronts. Ira's hat ripped from his head and spun into the street. A horse jerked against its hitch. Somewhere a child cried out. For one terrible second, Mabel did not move. Ira looked at her. No blood. Then he looked at Roan. The young man was laughing, but the laughter came too loudly now, forced through a silence that refused to join him. Pearl had gone pale. Not impressed, not amused, disgusted. Roan finally saw it. His smile weakened. Ira stepped into the dust and picked up the hat. The bullet had punched clean through the brim. He ran one thumb along the torn felt. 20 years of weather. 20 years of mornings at Keene Ranch. 20 years since Mabel had handed it to him and quietly believed he might finally stay. Roan could not know any of that. Ira raised his eyes. "My wife gave me that hat." The words were soft. The street somehow became quieter. Near the hitching rail, Abe Tern stopped breathing for a moment. He was staring past Ira now. At Buck, at the gray horse, then back at Ira, and the old freight driver's face lost every trace of color. Abe Tern had spent most of his life hauling freight through country where a man learned not to stare at things he wished to survive. Still, he stared at Ira Keene, then at Buck. The gray horse flicked one ear toward the street. Abe swallowed. "Roan!" Roan kept his revolver loose at his side. "What? You'd best put that away." The younger man gave him a sideways look. "You afraid of an old rancher?" Abe did not answer the question. "I've seen that horse before." A murmur moved through the people nearest him. Dale Wren pushed himself away from the post where he had been standing. His face tightened as he studied Ira more carefully. A woman near the dress shop reached down and pulled her boy behind her skirt. Roan noticed that. Then he noticed nobody was looking at Ira as though he were helpless anymore. They were looking at him as though they remembered something. Abe spoke again. "Gray horse. Same way of standing quiet when everything around him isn't." Roan laughed once. There was no humor in it. "You telling me the horse has a reputation?" "No." Abe's eyes stayed on Ira. "The man does." The words began moving, not loudly. They passed from one mouth to another in pieces. "Old gunfighter. 2 Colts. Roads north of Boise City. A man who had survived work that buried younger men." Nobody seemed to possess the whole story, which made it worse. Legends rarely survived because every detail was true. They survived because enough men remembered being afraid. Ira said nothing. That unsettled Roan more than any threat could have. Pearl Dace had stepped farther into the doorway now. She was no longer looking at Ira. She was looking at Roan, at the revolver still in his hand, at the mistake he had not yet finished making. Roan's mouth went dry. 3 minutes earlier, he had wanted Flint Rock to remember his name. Now he wanted the town to forget it had ever seen him. He slid the revolver back into its holster. For half a breath, Ira thought it might end there. Then somebody whispered behind Roan, "That's Keene." Roan heard it. His shoulders tightened. Fear came into his face fast and ugly. His hand dropped again. Not from confidence this time. From panic. Ira saw the movement. The street disappeared around him. His right hand lowered toward the Colt beneath his coat. No anger. No bravado. Only an old reflex waking up. Mabel saw it too. And suddenly the most dangerous man in Flint Rock was not the frightened boy reaching for his gun. It was the husband standing beside her who knew exactly what to do if he drew it. Roan's fingers closed around the grip. That was when Mabel understood the danger had changed. The first shot had come from vanity. This one would come from fear. Ira knew the difference too. His shoulders settled. His breathing slowed. The noise of Flint Rock seemed to pull away from him until only Roan's hand remained. Mabel had seen that stillness before. Years ago, on roads she no longer cared to remember. It frightened her more than shouting would have. "Roan," Abe Tern said. The boy did not hear him, or chose not to. A bead of sweat moved down Roan's temple. His eyes kept darting from Ira to the faces along the boardwalk. Everyone knew now. That was the part he could not stand. He had wanted witnesses when he fired the first shot. Now every witness felt like a judge. "If you're thinking on fixing this," Dale Wren said from across the street, "don't." Roan's thumb twitched. Ira's hand lowered another inch. Mabel moved closer, not in front of him, beside him. "Ira." He did not look at her. The old instincts had returned too cleanly. He knew where Roan's elbow would move before the gun cleared leather. He knew how much time there would be. He knew exactly where to put the first bullet. That knowledge had once kept him alive. Now it threatened everything he had spent 20 years building. Roan started to draw. "Wait." Mabel's voice cut across the street. Both men stopped. Roan's revolver had barely lifted from the holster. Ira's fingers were already touching his Colt. No one breathed. Mabel looked at Roan first. "He's scared now." Then she turned her eyes to Ira. "Don't make fear finish what pride started." Ira finally looked at her. Dust moved between them. Somewhere behind the stores, a loose sheet of tin knocked softly in the wind. "He fired close enough to kill you," Ira said. "I know. Close enough to kill you too?" "I know that too." Her voice stayed quiet. "That bullet is already gone. Killing him won't make it safer." Ira's hand remained on the Colt. For 20 years, he had believed he had left this version of himself behind. Now Flint Rock had seen it. Mabel had seen it. Worse, Ira had felt how little effort it took for the old reflex to return. There would be no pretending after this. He had reached the place where one movement could divide the rest of his life into before and after. And Mabel was the only person standing close enough to stop him. The moment stretched. Roan's hand shook on the revolver. Ira's did not. That difference told Mabel everything. If Roan finished the draw, Ira would finish the fight. There would be no warning shot, no dramatic exchange, just one frightened young man fallen into the dust because pride had pushed him too far and fear had carried him the rest of the way. Mabel stepped half a pace nearer. "Ira." His eyes stayed on Roan. "He knows now," she said. Roan swallowed hard. The bravado was gone. So was the boy who had laughed after shooting through a stranger's hat. What remained was someone suddenly old enough to understand death. Mabel looked directly at him. "Take your hand away." Roan did not move. Now, his fingers loosened. Slowly, painfully, his hand left the revolver. Ira's remained where it was. That frightened Roan almost as much. Mabel turned back to her husband. "You too." For the first time, Ira hesitated. Not because he wanted to kill Roan, because his body had already committed to the possibility. Years of survival did not disappear, simply because a man had found a ranch, a wife, and a quieter road. He looked at the torn brim in his left hand, then at Mabel. Her face was pale now, only now, after the danger had begun to pass. Ira lifted his right hand away from the Colt. A breath moved through the crowd. Someone behind the mercantile muttered a prayer. Then boots struck the boardwalk at a run. Deputy Clay Orr pushed through the gathering, coat half-buttoned, breathing hard. What happened? Nobody answered immediately. Clay looked from Ira to Roan, then saw the revolver at Roan's hip. "Give me that." Roan surrendered it without argument. Clay checked the cylinder and tucked the weapon into his own belt. "You're coming with me." Roan nodded. As Clay led him away, Roan looked once toward Pearl Dace. She stood where she had been all along. Her expression held no admiration, only disappointment. Roan lowered his eyes. No applause followed him down the street. No one praised Ira either. That mattered. There had been no victory, only a killing avoided by inches. Ira placed the damaged hat back on his head. Mabel climbed into the wagon. He followed. They left Flint Rock beneath a silence heavier than the one that had followed the gunshot. For several miles, neither spoke. Buck carried them through the afternoon at an easy pace. Then, Mabel looked ahead and asked the one question Ira had hoped she would not. "Would you have killed him?" Buck kept the wagon moving at the same patient pace, as if nothing had happened in Flint Rock. The road rolled through dry grass and low brush, familiar country opening around Ira and Mabel in long afternoon light. The farther they traveled from town, the quieter it became. Mabel did not repeat the question. She did not have to. Ira rested the damaged hat on his knee. Dust still marked the felt where it had struck the street. "If he'd finished that second draw," Ira said, "yes." Mabel looked ahead. "You would have killed him." "Yes." No excuse followed. No talk about reputation, law, or what Roan deserved. Just the answer. The wagon creaked over a shallow rut. Mabel folded her hands in her lap. "And if he hadn't drawn?" Ira turned the hat slowly. The bullet hole caught a thin line of sunlight. For years, he had believed the dangerous part of his life belonged to roads behind him. Keene Ranch had fences that needed mending, horses that needed feeding, a roof that complained in winter, and a woman who knew exactly how strong to make his coffee. He had trusted those ordinary things to make the old instincts disappear. They had not disappeared. They had only gone quiet. "I don't know," he said. Mabel finally looked at him. "That worries you." "It should." He rubbed his thumb along the torn edge of the brim. "Some things a man's better off never learning about himself." Mabel's expression softened, but she did not rescue him from the truth. "You learned one thing." "What's that?" "You stopped." Ira glanced toward her. "You stopped me." "I spoke." "You knew when." A small silence settled between them. Not comfortable yet, but honest. Mabel reached across the wagon seat and took his free hand. Ira closed his fingers around hers. No apology was needed between them. No promise either. They had lived too long together to mistake words for proof. Buck carried them on toward Keene Ranch. By the time the house came into view, the sun had dropped low enough to turn the fence wire gold. Ira put the damaged hat back on. Mabel noticed. "You keeping it?" He looked toward the porch. "For now." 2 days later, a rider appeared at the Keene gate. Young, alone, and carrying a brand new hat in both hands. In 2 days, Flint Rock did what small frontier towns did best. It remembered. The story moved from the mercantile to supper tables, from hitching rails to back porches, changing a little each time, but never improving Roan Voss's part in it. 3 months of swagger disappeared beneath one foolish gunshot. Men who had once watched him practice quick draws now smiled when he passed. Others did not smile at all. That was worse. Roan kept his eyes down and left his revolver with Deputy Clay Orr while the matter was sorted. Without the gun at his hip, he seemed younger. Pearl Dace found him outside the general store on the second afternoon. He saw her coming and straightened from habit, then thought better of it. "You thought I'd be impressed," she said. Roan stared at the boards beneath his boots. "For about 5 stupid seconds." Pearl waited. Roan looked up. "I suppose 5 was enough." It nearly was. There was no cruelty in her voice. That made it harder to hear. Roan glanced toward the street where the hat had landed. Pearl followed his eyes. "You know who impressed me?" He gave a tired smile. "Not me. Mabel Keene." The smile disappeared. Pearl folded her arms. "She stood between what you started and what Ira Keene knew how to finish." Roan said nothing. "She was scared," Pearl continued. "I saw it after, but she stayed there anyway." Roan remembered Mabel's voice. Not loud, not pleading, certain. Pearl stepped closer. "That's nerve. Not shooting near a man's head because people are watching." Roan took the words without defending himself. For once, he understood that defending his pride was what had brought him to that street in the first place. That evening, he bought a new hat. Plain felt, good quality, nothing showy. The next morning, he saddled his horse and rode toward Keene Ranch. By the time he reached the gate, dust coated his boots, and most of the speech he had prepared no longer sounded worth saying. Ira was on the porch. Mabel stood just inside the doorway. Roan dismounted and removed his own hat. Then he lifted the new one with both hands. "Whole town still talking," he said. Ira looked at the hat. Roan swallowed. "I figured I owed you more than an apology said in the street." Ira came down one porch step. He took the hat, turned it once in his hands, and said nothing. Ira Keene held the new hat for a long moment. It was better felt than the old one. Clean brim, straight crown, no sweat darkening the band, no rain stains, no dust ground into the seams. It also meant nothing to him. Roan stood at the foot of the porch, waiting. Ira set the new hat on the railing. "Keep it." Roan looked up. I know what you thought." Ira took off the old hat instead. The bullet hole showed white where the felt had torn. "I can buy another hat." Roan's eyes dropped. Ira ran one finger along the damaged brim. "Can't buy the reason I kept this one." Mabel leaned against the doorway behind him, silent. Ira looked at her. Near 20 years ago, she bought it for a man who still thought every road needed another mile. Mabel's mouth softened at the corner. Ira turned back to Roan. "That man finally stayed." Roan nodded slowly. The apology he had prepared seemed smaller now. Pearl told me she'd rather marry a coward than a man who shoots at strangers for applause. Ira considered that. Wise woman. Roan almost smiled. Didn't sound like an invitation. Then you'd better find out before you waste another month guessing. This time the smile came. Small, embarrassed, real. Roan picked up the new hat. Before mounting, he looked once toward Mabel. Ma'am, she nodded. No forgiveness was promised. No friendship either. Only the chance to leave Keene Ranch alive, humbled, and responsible for what he did next. Roan rode away beneath a long Idaho sky. The dust behind him settled slowly. That evening, Ira and Mabel sat on the porch while the light turned the pasture gold. Ira wore the old hat. Mabel reached over and traced the edge of the bullet hole with one finger. Ruined it. Ira adjusted the brim. No. He looked across the fence line toward the road disappearing west. Just added a story to it. Mabel rested her head against his shoulder. For a while neither spoke. The hat had marked the day Ira chose to stop wandering. Now it marked something else. The day he learned staying was not a choice a man made only once. Sometimes he had to choose it again, when anger gave him a reason to leave himself behind. The evening wind moved through the cottonwoods near the house. Ira listened to it. Then to Mabel breathing beside him, and for once, there was nothing in the silence he needed to fight. Thank you for riding with Ira and Mabel all the way to the end. Sometimes the strongest choice on the frontier was not pulling the trigger, but knowing when to let anger pass and give another man the chance to change. If this story stayed with you, please leave a comment and tell me whether you believe Roan deserved that second chance. And if you enjoy heartfelt Western romance, frontier survival, old ranches, hard choices, and quiet courage, subscribe so you won't miss the next story waiting beyond the horizon. Disclaimer: this is a fictional Western romance story inspired by life on the 19th century American frontier. Characters, events, dialogue, and dramatic situations are created for storytelling purposes. Historical settings and cultural details are researched for authenticity.